Good morning. Welcome to this edition of the Harvest Foundation Zoomcast, and we're interviewing Tyler Johnson today. And Tyler, welcome. Welcome to the program.
Great to be here.
And my co-host is Julian Gibb, and we'll be interviewing Tyler together. This Zoomcast is about interviewing people who can help us to understand what it means to be the hands and feet of Jesus. And that's why we call this Zoomcast Jesus' Hands and Feet. And the idea is not to lift up a person or an individual and say, aren't they great? The person is to learn how God is using different people to work through them to be his hands and feet in the lives of other people. So Tyler, you have a number of leadership roles within the body of Christ. One is the leadership of the Redemption churches. How many of those churches are there?
There's now 10. So we just launched or are in the midst of launching our 10th in North Phoenix.
Tyler, you need to come closer to your mic, closer to your computer. There we go.
So it's 10 congregations. We're just launching our 10th right now in North Phoenix.
Okay, praise the Lord. All right. And the other role that I'm familiar with, I'm sure you have many hats, like a number of us do, is the leader of the Surge Network. What is the Surge Network?
Yeah, so I'm a co-founder of the Surge Network, which is a network of churches throughout the state of Arizona, but that lives in kind of overlapping relationship with networks around the country as well. But this one's specified in Arizona, and there's kind of multiple forms to it. But there's a large monthly gathering that happens regionally, and then quarterly, all of those regions come together and gather. So for kind of best practices, emerging trends, lots of conversations. But then there's also a year-long curriculum that churches do inside of their churches that's really focused on what we're going to talk about today, practice-based discipleship, things like that. So there's 50 to 70 churches a year going through that. Many of them are repeating churches, but then there's onboarding of new churches. There's 100 plus churches throughout Arizona that are participating in Surge in one way or another.
Okay, what do you mean by practical or applied discipleship?
Yeah, I mean, at its, I'll start by saying this because it's fitting on this Zoomcast to say this. The understanding of this really Harvest had a lot to do with in understanding, but in simple form, it's this idea of if we took Jesus seriously and the number of times he's actually telling us very specifically and very clearly to do these things. So one of my greatest and favorite illustrations of this is that many people love Jesus's statement of come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. And we stop there, but his way in which he's going to give us rest is that he says, take my yoke upon you, which is his teaching, for my yoke is easy, my burden is light. And he's really calling us that as we practice the words he told us to do, which in simple form is love, that we actually experience the rest. So coming to him is more than just coming to him to receive a hug. It's to take his teaching upon us and do it. So practice-based discipleship is trying to make practicing the words of Jesus as practical and doable as possible, believing that we actually experience transformation more in the doing, being doers of the word, than we do just being hearers of the word.
You use the word transformation, and that's a term that's thrown out a lot in evangelical circles today. So when you talk about transformation, what do you mean, and how does that relate to practice-based discipleship?
Yeah, I mean, again, depending upon where you're coming from, transformation in theological terminology is sanctification, and sanctification is the process of becoming more like Jesus. So when Paul in Romans chapter 8 says we are predestined, God's plan for us, his predetermined plan for us is to conform us into the image of Jesus. And just simple, not to get too theological, Jesus is the exact image of God, the book of Colossians says. So it's becoming more human by becoming more like Jesus. So in the way in which we become more like Jesus or transformed into that is by doing what he says.
Okay, does that individual transformation relate at all to family transformation, community transformation, national transformation?
I think unquestionably. I mean, it and I think this is it absolutely does. I mean, in the sense of, so in short, there's many theories around this that I think are true theories because God is the author of creation, but the creation meaning the world that we live up in. But a lot of these theories inside of a family says the greatest way to change your family, they'll talk about it as a system, is change yourself. The only person that you can really change is by changing yourself. And so then this idea of proximity, which this gets a lot into our teaching. We'll talk about the proximity principles. So you focus on yourself first, then those who are most proximate to you, then the church, and then the world. And that doesn't mean, hey, if you get there at some point, get to the world. That's not what it's saying. It's just saying the greatest revealer of are we living this life, and the greatest opportunities we have to live this life are always in proximity with us. So it isn't saying individual at the expense of society or our cities, but it's saying you can't get truly to cities if you're not getting to yourself in the midst of that. Now, as we love, I would argue vehemently, you bump up against things that are inhibiting people from being truly human. Some of it's them teaching them what needs to happen. At other points, it's working on things that would better their lives, whether that could be anything from their lawn to a law in the midst of it. So,
right, yeah.
Tyler, this sounds great. I'm on board. You've got me. But how does this actually? Well, first of all, why do you need Jesus in all of this? I mean, surely there's loads of great books out there. There's government organizations. There are others who can help you to raise your child. Or so what? Why Jesus? Does this just sort of add another element to it?
Yeah, I agree. I really appreciate the question. Yeah, and I wouldn't. I don't think Jesus adds another element to it. I mean, I think Jesus is the central point and reason for human life. So in the end, the logic of the New Testament that teaches us about Jesus oftentimes will say, love your neighbor. But as you watch the progression, it's actually love as he loved, which is sacrificially at death to yourself. And one way we like to talk about it is that death, the dying to self, is at the center of love, but you have to depend, therefore. So these two D's, death is at the center of love, and you have to depend to do it. Because anytime I'm confronted, even as a husband, to get off the couch and help my wife in the kitchen or with the kids, there's this sense of like, I got to die to myself. And the reality is that doesn't just come easy to me or to anybody. So that's the dependence, and I think this is why Jesus says it's better for you that I go, that I send a helper who's drawing us to Jesus, is that we really do need help in doing this. Kind of with man, this is impossible. With God, all things are possible. So in simple answer, I don't think human beings can get to the point where we really consider the needs of others, really live out our created design to be outward oriented in love, because the nature of sin, St. Augustine was famous for saying sin is a radical curvature inward. We turn in on ourselves, and that destroys our relationship with God and our relationship with our neighbor. So who deals with sins? Jesus. And who walks with us to teach us and to train us the way to walk is Jesus. So I want to be clear, I don't think Jesus is a supplementary add-on. I think he fosters and he's the fuel to this life.
Right.
That everybody desires.
What would you say to those who say, well, lots of religions or emphases do this without Jesus. So how can you say that Jesus is what you say he is, the center of this?
Yeah, and I mean, this is getting a little bit for your hearers into what's called apologetics. Like, how would you give a defense for this? I think as a Christian, I want to affirm everywhere any religion and or ideology is living out things according to the way God planned. What I would like to say in those moments, and I'm in these moments often, is to say the only thing that actually makes sense of this is Jesus, how he made the world, how he's making meaning of the world, and how he gives meaning to why it's better to give than it is to receive. So I just, in the end, Alistair McGrath has this line of, humanly speaking, I'm a Christian because it makes the best sense of the world. And so, and I do think there's major deficiencies overarching that are outside of the constructs of what I'd call a biblical worldview. I think things just in the end, it isn't just that the paradigm makes sense more. I really do think it works better. Like when I can recognize the depth and reality of my own sin and sin that's in the world, the reality that we need outside help and a savior, both to save us from that sin and empower us into the future. I'll say one other thing, because I think one of the most dominating, at least in Western culture and growing because of globalization. So secular humanism, there's a recognition in this, and I think this really speaks to a lot that I learned through Harvest, but there are a lot of people pursuing justice and the realities of the power of love in the midst of the world. One of my favorite definitions of justice is what love looks like when it's made public. And you'll see a lot of people doing that without Jesus. So if you took all of these things of like rightful treatment of women, understanding of ethnicity and how different people have been pursued, just labor laws, whatever, all these things. I mean, just keep adding to it. People are working just immigration laws, working on all these levels without Jesus in many forms better than the churches. They're giving themselves and caring more than the churches. I don't think that discredits I don't want to say it doesn't discredit Jesus, but I don't think it goes, oh, Jesus is irrelevant. I think what it does is it really shines a light on the church. And I think it's part of judgment. Judgment begins with the household of God, but I also think it's powerless in the long run. I think in the end, the same treatment of those people will begin to happen because it's what sin does to power whatever words you want to begin to use. It flips on itself. And so I think this is why people throughout history, you know, I mean, Gandhi's a very easy one, took the teachings of Jesus so seriously, even in the end, if he didn't believe fundamentally he was the savior for our sin, he understood the power and the teachings of Jesus, which I think is for lack of a better term, a prophetic critique of the church. So we live in a world that wants all of the benefits of Jesus without Jesus. And I want to affirm where that's good, but I also want to vehemently say that's a real problem.
So
Right.
Tyler, with the so to put this into terms that even I can understand. So I don't like what you're saying, because what you're saying is that I'm not perfect and that I can't save the world by myself. So I need the power of Jesus Christ operating through me. One, so that I'm not this destructive vessel, but I'm actually can be used to love people that naturally I wouldn't love, that naturally I'd sort of keep away. So that it's Christ operating through me, so about mentally and in other ways, so that he can perform his mission here on earth. Not that he needs me, but that he uses us. As he used like St. Paul and all sorts of people. So with Surge and with redemption, how in practical ways is that taking place? How is Christ using Surge and redemption in order to carry out his mission here on earth?
Yeah, so I want to start by saying I am convinced. So I've been a pastor now for 19 years at Redemption in some form or fashion, youth ministry. And I am more convinced than ever that I can relate a little more with Bob, who's given his life to this. This is the hardest aspect of ministry, way harder than getting up and preaching the truth of God's word. The reality to get a people collectively together working towards practicing the ways of Jesus, which is practicing love, is very difficult, which to me is a major screams out of why we need God's help in order to do this. So many people, I'm going to answer your question directly, but I want to say this. Many people love the idea of Jesus's teachings as like a bumper sticker. So this idea of love your enemies or turn the other cheek or the practices of the Sermon on the Mount, it all sounds nice, but when it gets down to it, people will say things like, yeah, but that's not practical. We have pastors on TV saying Jesus is great, pastors, but I wouldn't want him to be my president. And so it's almost like he's not practical, right? It's just like, it's nice, but it's not practical. And I think the reason we all say that is because it feels impossible. Like when you live a real life, you're going, I can't really love my enemies the way Jesus is telling me to love them, because he's telling me to love them the same way he tells me to love my neighbor. So it feels impossible, which I think is, again, true. I think it's a revelation of the simplest us. So I say that to say, this is where this gets very hard, is that people always want to move. And I remember learning this from Bob over a decade ago. People would always rather in a small group go back to a book study than to talk about the rhythms and practices that we're trying to make the center part. But in answer to your question, so Redemption uses Surge. Surge operates in 3 learning environments. So we have a curriculum that we go through. We have gatherings where all the participants of Surge come together. But the heart of it is these tables that are oriented around practices. And we orient them around this acronym called BLESS, which is, bless, listen, eat, speak, and Sabbath are the things. So blessing, we try to get really tangible, and we'll give them a spectrum of so bless a believer, an unbeliever, somebody not like you. And a blessing could be easy as a simple word. But again, this is very oriented towards what Harvest taught us. We really emphasize that this can't be showing up to your group going and thinking in the moment, who did I bless this week? Who did I say? You're proactive, not reactively answering the question. So you're trying to think tonight, like as I'm doing kind of what in the history of the church was a daily examine. And typically in a daily examine, everybody does a daily examine, but they'll say like, how was my day today? And they'll be like, my day was awful. And they'll sit there. Almost never do they go, how did I love today? But we're trying to get people in a daily examine to ask, how did I love today? With the promise, you'll be happier. That's the word. It's better to give than it is to receive. You will feel more satisfied, tap into what it really means to be human more by giving. So as you evaluate your day, then you're planning your next day. How am I going to bless? Then the L is listen to God and listen to people. So it's listening to God almost as your eyes are to the real world, saying, who's he calling me to love today? What are the opportunities today? Eating is just this idea of eat. Jesus really did eat his way of the Gospels. There's almost no more relational thing on earth than having a cup of coffee or eating with somebody. So we're trying to say, you're going to eat because you're human. Try to do it with somebody, whether that's a moment at the water cooler, but you're being intentional. And that's, again, we use that a believer, an unbeliever, somebody not like you through the week. So it's just saying, if you're going to eat or you're going to have a coffee break or you're going to do whatever, try to just be intentional. And then with eating, we'll say at least once a month, and we're trying to make it very doable. Try to have somebody in your home or go to a restaurant with a group of people to make it a little more intentional. And then speak is speak to God in prayer and speak to others about Jesus. So make Jesus a regular part of your conversation. And then the Sabbath is just really trying to say, we've got to rest, like we've got to be human, but that gets into rest and recreation. So even that can add people to it depending upon kind of what gives you life. So that said, that's practically how we are trying to put these things in practice, but it is astounding even in Surge. And as we use that in Redemption, how much people want to go back to, let's just talk about the content. So what
I want to ask, I mean, if you push this, to it's what seems to me like a logical conclusion, you could say Is it possible to think of then that everything we do with others and even with ourselves could be seen from the perspective of discipleship? So discipleship is not a specific isolated action, but it's something that we ought to be doing with everything we do.
No question. No question. I mean, I think honestly, that's just what Jesus modeled. Is it was very on the road as things came to him, and his way he pursued things. And I think that's the best definition of discipleship, is being enlisting in school with Jesus.
Okay.
Is so that we're in it. But absolutely, I think that's true. And I do think that's a real problem in Western, at least US based discipleship, is it's so curriculum or annual or a program based, and all of those are catalytic. I mean, we have that in Surge. There are things, you're walking people through, but when those things get equated, I think it's really problematic, because it's like, I went through a discipleship school.
Right. Yeah. It's not, it's something separate from lifestyle. Yeah. And discipleship, in a sense, should be, that's our lifestyle. Yeah. That's what we do. That's how we live.
Relationship.
I want to get real practical, hoping that we've got some church leaders listening to us. I know we do. Practically, as a pastor or as a leader, you don't have to be the senior pastor, but just as a leader in a local church, how do you organize the structure, of the church to equip people to live this way?
Yeah,
what are some practical steps?
I think one of the best practices that we've established is what we call telling stories of lived love. So in every environment, small group, when we gather, we're saying, tell stories of lived love. So what's happening is those stories are raising people's attention to God is at work, and where God's at work. So that's one aspect. The other thing is they're inspirational, because as people tell them, and we really try to say, lived love can be really simple. You're going to hear stories that sound dramatic, but they're really simple. And so they're inspirational. People begin to go, I can do that. And then as they do it and get to tell the story, C.S. Lewis has this, is that the completion of our joy is in the expression of it. So it's like they experience the joy in doing it. Then when they get to tell the story of it, they're watching. And I think this has a lot of, when Paul talks about everybody has a word, everybody has a psalm, everybody has a hymn, it builds this. And when that becomes, for lack of a better term, ritualistic in the life of your church, people are just telling these stories all the time. I've found nothing better than that, even better than like slogans, statements, is that people are very fueled and formed by stories, by real.
So would you say that the typical morning worship service lacks that telling of stories?
You're catching me at a good time, Bob, because I'm growing very skeptical of how we've typically done things in terms of towards actual change. But yeah, I mean, it's in saying this, if people know Redemption, they go, where do you do that? We have done it in multiple places. We'll call all of life interviews, where we're trying to take where people are typically in their 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and getting them to show how they're actually through their work, their profession, or their calling, depending upon, so not just occupation, but vocation,
right,
how they're actually loving people. So we do that, and we've seen huge fruit from that. And those are interviews in Sundays of.
You do that during the worship service?
We do. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, frequently.
What out of the time, your worship service is probably an hour and a half?
Hour to hour and 15. Mm-hmm.
Okay. How much of that is committed to telling stories?
7 minutes, probably 7 to 10 minutes, depending upon if somebody goes over, which they typically do. So, and we also do communion every week. So, I mean, it's feasible. I mean, it really is feasible to craft this. And we do the other part. So Redemption's 10 congregations. So it's it's 10 churches that operate. I'll always, my shorthand is to say we're tighter than any network or denomination I've seen, but looser than the common trend of mega church.
Okay.
Because but we gather our leaders together once a month, and we craft a moment that really is trying to raise the imagination of local leaders in these churches of how they could do things in churches. And we do a lot of storytelling, we'll do music, and I typically will do some form of a message, but much shorter. So it's really high on story, much shorter on, and it really is trying to, what I said, raise imagination. It's not trying to say you have to do it like this. But what happens in all of those, and this is a great contrast. I wouldn't have gone here, Bob, if you had not said it, because it's triggering my thought. But I really do think there's more inspiration and equipping, to use the word in Ephesians, out of those moments than maybe we ever get on a Sunday.
Both. I'm there.
Now I just said
now I want you to tell us some stories.
Yeah.
Well,
I'll tell you one story about that, in particular about that gathering. So when we were in the midst of telling stories of lived love, there was a pastor on one of our teams that was their congregation was going through a really hard situation because there had been a youth in their church that had taken fentanyl and died. And it was this catastrophic event in the life of the church. The church is a working poor congregation in West Phoenix. And he's in the midst of this. He's at the bedside of the family, weeping and wailing. And I'm in the middle of this large room. I mean, it's 100+ leaders, probably 125 leaders in this room. And I texted, I said, you need to share that story. And it's very interesting because a lot of times the stories of lived love are so celebratory, great stories, that nobody's telling the stories of just loving by a bedside in the midst of grief. Mm-hmm. But he says, there's no completion to the story. I said, and I'm texting him, that's why you need to share the story.
Yeah.
So he shares, and they have this table of people, and they start crying because they're living in it. We're all away from it. We don't know this family, and they start crying. And one of the things they say is this family doesn't have any money, and they're terrified by how they're going to be able to pay for any form of a memorial service. Well, they say that, and at the moment, there's another leader in the room, not from their church, who writes me and says, can we ask right now for prayer and to take up an offering in this room? And so I'm like, hey, John has something to say. He stands up and he says, I think God's saying we need to take an offering in the room right now. And they did, and they raised double what the people needed in that room, not even by going to the churches. Just people right there said, here's what we have, and paid for the whole thing. That family who had lost their son had actually been not attending the church for some time. And this whole thing they were so overwhelmed. I mean, they went in literally, I think within a day and a half with a check. So everybody started sending, right, the moment's like, how do we do it? How do we send money in? And our finance guy's like, I'm trying to figure out how to do this. But he gathered and gave the money. And that family, literally, they tell the story that they fell on the floor and saying, surely God's amongst us. This is we never asked for this. We never imagined this, but that all just came out of, and that's another power of sharing these stories, is it raises more opportunities and they follow. So that's one. I mean, that's a great story, but we have stories, we have incredible stories with local schools. So the campus I'm sitting at right now, Redemption Gilbert, partners with a Title I school. And this is all the way to right in the midst of COVID, they're trying to do all online learning. They don't have the computers, and it gets into dynamics of the system of the district and whatever. And we have people bringing computers, putting together food boxes so they can retain, while kids aren't in school, their food box program to what's happening. So our church, almost single-handedly is running their food distribution center to these families, developing relationships with them. You know, these will obviously cycle, but then all the way down to there's like an incredible story of a fireman that's
Okay,
a
but
part of.
before
Go
you
ahead.
tell that story, and because we're running out of time,
Yes.
I have one last question
Hmm.
for you. And that question is Tyler Johnson. What about you?
Yeah.
What is recent story from your life in terms of how God has enabled, worked through your hands and your feet to be Jesus to somebody else?
Yeah. So I have, you know, both my boys are active in the baseball world. So that's actually what brought me to Arizona. And so we're doing real life. And in the midst of real life, you bump up against a lot of couples in troubled marriages. And so it's astounding to me the ministry that happens in stands at a baseball field that is way beyond just, I'll tell two stories from this, and I'm very cautious about this, but one is with a troubled marriage that's in the midst of this, that came all the way back in the last couple of weeks and said, honestly, if you weren't here in the midst of this, we would not still be married. Like there's absolutely no way. And it's time, it's presence, it's conversation, it's going out. And then there's one all the way to, there was a man that was helping on one of the baseball teams that very evidently when COVID hit, he was struggling. I mean, a ton of his business had been taken away, and yet he continued to volunteer his time to invest in these 12-year-old boys. And I just kept thinking, it isn't just gospel ministry that a labor is worthy of their wages, but this man is working on behalf of the community. And so I was able to rally up some of my own and some other people's money and give him a check. And then right now that same team is that same idea is like together what we could do, congealing. So he teaches lessons and he has a really raggedy old baseball cage. So we gave him a substantial check that he blew his absolute mind. And then right now the whole group of team parents are pitching in to buy him a whole new batting cage, which will enable him to do his business specifically. So that's all. And that's with majority unbelievers. Who vehemently know who I am, who will show up to Easter services. So love is wildly evangelistic.
Yeah, I was thinking that through what you've been sharing, as well as part of our earlier discussion, that how can people who are not believers do this sometimes better than
They do.
Christians
Yep.
do it? And I wonder if the answer isn't that whether we are followers of Jesus or not, we're all made in the image of God.
Mm-hmm.
And we all have the imprint of God, his fingerprint on our lives, whether we know it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the beauties of intentional discipleship is pulling that imprint
It's so true.
of who we are made, in whose image we are made, into the open. And I believe that that can be one of the most effective means of drawing people to Jesus.
I couldn't agree with you more.
So, Tyler, thank you so much
Thank you both.
for your time together. And we'll look forward to being with you again.
Great.
God bless you. And for those of you who are watching, this is the video cast, the Zoom cast of Jesus' Hands and Feet. God bless you. And as you leave today, ask the question intentionally, what would God have me to do to be Jesus' hands and feet?